Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Thursday, March the 20th, 2024. I always thought that spring began on March 23rd. I may be wrong, but it's rather unseasonal to think that today, in Asia, of all places, Major League Baseball is beginning a game between the Los Angeles Dodgers and the San Diego Padres in Korea, of all places. One sports network asks why the Dodgers and Padres are playing in Korea. I'm sure most of our listeners can guess. It's money. I'm sure they're not choosing to play there. It certainly reflects a profoundly different kind of game to the one many Americans associate with baseball, the most American, for better or worse, of all games. And one wonders what perhaps the most American of all baseball players, Pete Edward Rose Sr., otherwise known as Charlie Hustle, Pete Rose, would think about this. I haven't got Pete Rose on the show. I should have invited him. I don't know how to track him down, but I got the next best thing. His biographer, Keith O'Brien, New York Times bestselling writer, wonderful writer, has a new book out. It's out early next week, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. And I was going to say Pete, but Keith is joining us from New Hampshire, near the coast. We didn't get Pete, Keith. So what do you think? You've studied him. You've written this book. What do you think he would think about the baseball season, firstly, starting so early, March 20th, and secondly, beginning in Korea?
Well, Pete's a huge baseball fan. He lived to play baseball, honestly. And so the start of baseball season was always one of the greatest days of his life every spring. And so I know that he would appreciate the start of any baseball season. And I will say, most people don't think about him in this way, but Pete Rose was also a master promoter, frankly. And this year's opening day, the so-called Seoul series opening in Seoul, Korea, is a fantastic way to market the game globally. And so in that regard, I think he would appreciate it as well.
Yeah, very generous. I wonder whether he might have some concerns. Anyway, the subtitle of your book, Keith, which really struck my attention, is The Last Glory Days of Baseball. Is that your view, Rose's view, the conventional view? The 60s, 70s, and 80s, were they the last glory days of baseball?
So, I want to be clear that that's my view. While I did interview Pete at length for this book, this is a work of history, a work of journalism. He had no say so in its content, and in fact, hasn't been returning my calls for some time.
Well,
So
Pete, if you're watching, return Keith's calls.
seriously, but this is my view, and this is, I think, supported by the numbers, and baseball is a game of numbers. Without question, baseball, America's pastime, loomed far larger in the cultural consciousness in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s than it does today. I mean, to be totally honest with you, Andrew, I think most people are unaware that the baseball season has even started. And the average person probably can't name more than one player in that game between the Padres and the Dodgers. So,
and we know if they can name one player, I'm sure we know who they would name, right?
Right, it would be Shohei Ohtani, absolutely. So, in the one critical way, I think, to come at Pete's story, the story of his rise and fall, the story of this great baseball legend, but also a controversial figure and notorious gambler, one of America's most notorious gamblers, is to look at it through the lens of the time in which he was living. And, Pete Rose was a professional ball player from June 1960 to August 1989. That's 30 seasons.
Astonishing.
It is astonishing. And anybody can look at that frame of time, 1960 to 1989, and know that absolutely everything changed in the world during that time. And it also changed in baseball, on the field and off of it. And so one of the things I tried to do with this book was turn the camera back to that time, and really look at Pete Rose's story in the window in which he lived. And I think one thing we struggle to do often is to remember how we thought about something at the time when it was happening. And so one of my key goals with the project in writing Charlie Hustle was to go back and do that.
Keith, I'm sure most people who haven't read the book, who don't know a lot about Pete Rose's background, would guess that he was born into poverty and was Charlie Hustle even before he picked up a baseball bat. Is that true?
No, neither of those things are true. Pete did come from the west side of Cincinnati, born and raised on the west side of Cincinnati.
Classic baseball town, right? I mean,
well, right, the original professional baseball town, Cincinnati, and in the time in which Pete was growing up, the 1940s and 50s, baseball was the biggest game in town, just as it was the biggest game in America. His neighborhood on the west side of Cincinnati was predominantly white, predominantly working class. It still is, by the way, today. And so, while he wasn't from poverty, he also wasn't from money. And this notion of hustle was really ingrained into him by his father, who was also named Pete. On the west side at that time, everyone would have called him Big Pete. And Big Pete himself was a prominent local athlete. His best sport was football. And these were years in Cincinnati where there was no professional football team. So Big Pete Rose played on a semi-pro, essentially weekend football team on the west side, and he was dominant in that league. And so when his first son is born, Pete Rose, in 1941, he really from the beginning wants to see this boy become a sports hero in his own right.
Does Rose have a little bit of the Donald Trump about him, in the sense that he was bullied by a father who wanted to live again through his son?
It's complicated. Pete Rose, when you speak to him, if you speak to him, still worships his father today. Big Pete has been dead for 54 years. And Pete Rose still will say he was the greatest man he ever knew. That said, I think Big Pete was also a difficult man and a demanding man. We didn't have a word for Big Pete in those days, in the 1950s, when young Pete Rose was coming up as a ball player. But we do today. Big Pete would have been that sort of classic, sort of over-the-top youth sports dad.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted his son to be great at sports, and he really did everything he could to make that happen. One thing I did for this book, Andrew, was, I tried to interview anyone who had crossed paths with Pete over the years, played with him in particular. And, Pete played in 1956 when he was 15 years old on a prominent Legion Ball teenaged baseball team on the west side that won a city title in Cincinnati, and in fact won a national tournament in the summer of 1956. And the players I spoke to on that team could scarcely remember their own fathers coming to the games. I mean, this was a time
they all remember Big Pete.
They remember Big Pete being there.
And so again, not that unusual. The assumption I'm not a hardcore baseball fan, Keith, and as you can tell, I didn't grow up in this country, but one always associates Rose with self-invention, that he wasn't born with huge talent. He wasn't maybe DiMaggio or Babe Ruth. He was self-made. Is there some truth to that?
There is. I think of him as honestly the most ordinary, extraordinary athlete we've maybe ever had. Uh, he was not particularly big. He was not particularly athletic. He was not particularly strong. And even into high school, he was not particularly skilled. Many players from Pete Rose's high school on the west side of Cincinnati were recruited to play Major League Baseball. Pete was not. He really did have to work his way there.
Yes, it's a wonderful story. It's, in a sense, I guess, and this comes back to the glory days of baseball and perhaps the glory days of America. It's a quintessentially American story of the self-made man without innate ability who created himself.
That's true. Absolutely. And it's one reason why the press gravitated to it. And I will say that, while the hustle was real, the story was real, the press in the 1960s and 70s, which was also all male and predominantly all white and working class, just like Pete, really did amplify this story and turn what was, a story into almost like mythological sized narrative. And, that was lucky for Pete because, many times the press in telling us this story was not telling us other things about him.
Right. Was there a, Keith, I'm thinking aloud here, a subtext to this? Of course, Rose lived in those 30 years where the white American working class did a bit of a Pete Rose and reinvented itself, going from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. It was the years of race riots, of enormous civil rights unrest, and increasing unease, I guess, between the races. Is Rose himself and his story a metaphor for those years for the white working class?
It was. I mean, the 1960s in particular was a time of great change in baseball. And again, it's hard to imagine it now, but when Pete was a rookie minor leaguer in 1960, the league was almost entirely still white. And over the course of the 1960s, that would change in dramatic fashion. By the end of the decade, many of the prominent stars in baseball were Latino, Dominican, and Black. And here was Pete, who sort of represented something about the earlier age of baseball. The previous age of baseball, the Mickey Mantle, Joe DiMaggio era.
But there's an even darker era before that of, who was the overtly racist pitcher?
Which one?
Well, there's one in particular, I think, who was a member of the KKK. Anyway, I mean, much of the history of baseball is bound up in white racism, isn't it?
As is much of the history of America. I mean,
right, exactly.
There sort of three third rails of our culture are gender, class, and race, and those kind of things are all interwoven with the story of baseball as well.
Gender, class, and race. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people are thinking this as they're listening to you, Keith. Was Rose a racist? Did he distinguish between black and white teammates? Did he look down on blacks?
So, in 1963, when Pete was a rookie, he was not well liked by his teammates, the white teammates on the team. Pete had sort of jumped the line and passed over some other guys that some of his teammates thought should have been there. Pete was also arrogant and brash and outspoken. He didn't toe the line as a rookie,
as one would expect.
Well, certainly from Pete Rose, as one would expect, and so a real formative experience for Pete was his two friends on the team in 1963 were also sort of outcasts on the Cincinnati Reds. One was an outfielder named Veda Pinson, and the other is a future Hall of Famer who many of your viewers and listeners will have heard of. It was Frank Robinson, and they befriended Pete, and Pete never forgot that. And I did multiple interviews with black teammates over the years, or players he played against in on other teams, who spoke warmly about Pete and the kindness that he showed them. That said, Pete Rose, both then and now, could hardly speak in the progressive, language of the times, or really even truly understand the kind of world that Frank Robinson and Veda Pinson were living in.
These were blacks, of course. They didn't have an ounce of woke in him.
Absolutely not. And, back in those days in the locker room in particular, Andrew, Pete was known for making, crass jokes, in which, racial tropes, played in the punchline. But that was Pete Rose, for better or for worse.
Yeah, we all know Pete Rose. I think my kids and wife think of me as the Pete Rose in our family. It sounds to me as if professional sports and the military in America are rather similar. Lots of characters like Rose in both institutions, and a lot of the sort of paradoxes of race you find in both institutions. That white guys like Rose may not be particularly keen on their black teammates or colleagues, but because they literally rub shoulders with them every day, go into battle, go into games with them, it gives them a different perspective on race. Is there any truth to that?
What I can say is this: even into the 1970s, mid to late 1970s, when baseball was much more diverse, typically speaking, in most locker rooms, the black players hung out with the black players and the white players hung out with the white players. And that was just a reality of the time, a reality of the sport, and a reality of our culture. But one of Pete's closest friends on the Reds in the 1970s was Joe Morgan, who was black and was particularly outspoken about racial
And
equity.
later played out here at Oakland, right?
He's originally from actually the Bay Area, born and raised out there. Joe.
And the A's were another side of traditional baseball, a very different side. I want to take a break in a second, Keith, but you mentioned the three pillars of American society: gender, class, race. We've talked about class and race. What about gender? We haven't mentioned any women yet. Pete got himself into trouble with various underage girls, one in particular. You haven't mentioned his mother. Was she the woman at home while Big Pete took Pete to the baseball practice, doing the laundry, doing the cooking? Did he have a very stereotypical view of gender?
He grew up in a very stereotypical house, without question. His mother was the sort of prototypical housewife, to use the term of the day, in the 1940s and 50s, and his father, was not the sort of man to lavish love and praise upon his boys in particular. And so, yeah, without question, Pete grew up in a stereotypical house, and made many poor choices over the years with how he interacted with women. His gambling by the mid 1970s and late 1970s in Cincinnati was an open secret, even a punchline sometimes in public, and his affairs were an open secret as well.
But many sports stars of that age, basketball players, footballers, baseball players, were notorious or even famous for their success with women. I use that word carefully. It wasn't sometimes hard for professional sports people, especially of guys like Rose's notoriety to be successful. Was there something unusual about Rose? Did he just have poor judgment, or did he happen to live at a time where everything was changing and the only thing that didn't change was him?
I think both things are true, Andrew. In everything Pete did, whether it was how he hit in the batting cage, how he played on the field, how he interacted with women off of it, or how he gambled, Pete seemed to take things to the extreme, and that was part of his personality. But you're right. I mean, one of the great baseball books of all time is a memoir that came out 54 years ago in 1970. Jim Bouton's Ball Four. It was a sort of unvarnished memoir written by a pitcher who was at the tail end of his career and had briefly tasted some success with the Yankees and the Cardinals. And Bouton in Ball Four in 1970, wrote openly about how the players chased women on the road, had affairs and girlfriends in many towns. Again, this was how many of these guys handled themselves in those days. And I will say one reason, probably why, Andrew, was because of the makeup of the press corps. Again, I mentioned previously that the press was all male and almost entirely white, and there was one reason for that. Female reporters were not permitted in Major League Baseball locker rooms until 1979, which would have been Pete's 17th season or 16th season in the major leagues. And when they were finally permitted into the locker room, it wasn't because Major League Baseball had suddenly had an epiphany. It was because they were facing lawsuits in multiple states. So it was the ultimate old boys club in those days.
Gender, class, race, three things that have shaped and continue to reshape America, as Keith O'Brien is explaining in his wonderful new book. It's out next week, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. Take a short break and then talk about how baseball's changed over the last 50 years since Rose. But I want to remind everyone that guys like Keith O'Brien are brought to us because of Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics. Excellent new publication. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Keith O'Brien to talk more Charlie Hustle. Don't go away, anyone.
News, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. Given it's the day that baseball begins in Seoul, Korea, of all places, we're talking with Keith O'Brien, the author of Charlie Hustle, a wonderful new biography of Pete Rose. Keith, you touched on gambling earlier, and perhaps that's a bridge we can make between the baseball of Charlie Hustle, the baseball age of Charlie Hustle, and the baseball of the 2020s. Was Rose unusual in the sense that his gambling was just out of control, or was he another stratosphere? How would you explain the gambling? It was the thing that, of course, in some ways brought him down.
Well, it is the thing that brought him down, without question. Pete was sort of raised in a culture of gambling. His father loved going to the racetrack, the horse track in Cincinnati. Baseball in the 1960s, in particular, spring training baseball was almost framed around gambling. Players down in Florida would play the games in the afternoon and then go to the horse track and the dog track at night, and in the Tampa Clearwater area. Pete's gambling, unlike many others, escalated. By the 1970s, he was gambling with bookies on football, on basketball. Again, his dealings with bookies and relationships with bookies and preference to gamble were all of this was well known by the mid to late 1970s in Cincinnati, but also my reporting shows even in Major League Baseball's head office in New York. But it really devolved from there. And again, my reporting shows that whether Pete's willing to say it or not, he suffered from a gambling addiction in the 1980s. And this addiction did spiral out of control. I interviewed for this book, not just Pete Rose, but 3 different men who placed Pete's bets on baseball. And all 3 of them, who were at one point some of Pete's closest friends, all 3 of them agreed that Pete Rose was addicted. He had a problem. And, there are not many printed paper records of Pete's bets. There's only some from the spring and summer of 1987, some from the spring and summer of 1986. And what I could say is this, Andrew. If you're a smart bettor, a sharp, as you would be called in Vegas, you're making targeted bets. You're betting on, 2 or 3 games, maybe not even that. You might just be betting on one, going all in on one because you believe strongly that the data suggests a certain outcome. Pete was betting at times on 8, 10, 12 games a day. And this is at a time, of course.
So, I mean, I don't know. I'm the last person to defend Pete Rose, but so he bet a lot. So he was addicted. Many professional sports people have addictive personalities: alcohol, drugs, women, gambling. Did he bet on himself? I mean, the whole point about betting was it implies that you're a cheat. Is there in your research, and you've looked at Rose's life very carefully, do you think he cheated when it came to his gambling and his playing?
There is no evidence, nor any witness accounts that Pete Rose ever bet against the Reds, against his own team. And I would agree with you that this term addiction or gambling addiction would have been hard to stomach or present to the public in 1989 as a reason for his unraveling. But today, that's completely different. We are now legally gambling on sports in this country in most states. In many of those states, you can do it on your phone with a tap and a swipe. And your money is in.
Yeah, you wrote an interesting piece actually in the Atlantic, and I want to come to the journalism aspect here in a minute. You'll miss sports journalism when it's gone. When you talk about the rise of $100 billion gambling industry, where everyone's gambling online, everyone now is Pete Rose, especially kids, aren't they?
It's a frightening new landscape, certainly for young men, and I say that because the science, peer-reviewed scientific journals going back for decades, show that young men in particular are at risk for.
But also women. I know 1 or 2 women also who like to gamble. I mean, it's not just men.
Oh no, it's not just men. It's just they're more prone to it statistically. But you're right. It is anywhere from 2 to 4, possibly more % of the population is prone to problem gambling. And when the opportunity to gamble is more prevalent, it's also clear based on research that the problem goes up. And so I think we are going to see more gambling addiction in America. We already are, in fact, in states where gambling has been legalized, calls to 1-800 gambling helplines have surged as much as 300%.
Do you think that Pete Rose could actually have some public value if he agreed to be wheeled out to warn young kids about addiction? I guess he would never publicly acknowledge. What was his stand on his own gambling? Did he ever acknowledge that he was addicted?
He's been at conflict with himself over the years on that. At times, he has said that he was addicted and sought help for it. At other times, he has made light of his choices and minimized his choices. And
classic addict, I guess. It's not different from many people who are addicted to alcohol or drugs or gambling or women.
I would agree with that, and we can criticize Pete for many things. Many of those criticisms are deserved. But the idea that he, when presented with evidence that he was gambling on baseball in 1989 and then lied about it, is often simply said to be deceptive, and it certainly was. But it is also classic addict behavior. Again, evidence shows that two things typically prevent gambling addicts from being honest about their problem. The first thing is embarrassment or shame, and the second thing is indebtedness, being in debt to bookies.
Did Rose, was he a good gambler? I don't mean morally good. Did he mostly lose money?
Based on my reporting, Pete Rose, like a lot of gamblers, had highs and lows. But as one man told me, who was a former police officer in Cincinnati and often worked security details for Pete, he said that Pete Rose was the worst gambler he had ever seen.
Which only makes him more attractive. I mean, everybody knows that Michael Jordan was a massive gambler, got himself into trouble. He's still iconic in the basketball world, still the king of basketball. Is it right that Rose seems to have been persecuted for his gambling? Should he be in the Hall of Fame?
Well, that's the $64,000.
Well, that's why I'm asking you, and nobody can answer this better than you. In my mind, he should be in there because many of these players, I'm sure, did worse than Rose, even if we don't know about it.
Well, Andrew, you've read my book, so you know that, I'm not here to take sides on his Hall of Fame.
Well, that's why I got you on the show. I mean, what do you think, though? I mean, I'm curious.
Well,
should he be in or out, Pete? You can't be halfway. You can't be half pregnant here.
My take on it is this. I think we have a culture of hero worship in this country. We like to put our athletic icons on pedestals that they often don't deserve, and we like to ascribe to them high moral character that they often don't have.
Usually don't have, especially when it comes to athletes. At best, they're usually just a bit dim, aren't they?
Well, at the end of the day, athletes are just like you and I. They are flawed people.
But they're not just like you and I. They're people who have spent 95 or 99% of the time on an athletics field, which means they're less interesting usually.
Well, they're flawed people with money and access to things that most of us don't have. And about your question, because I don't want to dodge it, I would say this. I believe that players should be enshrined or not enshrined into the Hall of Fame based on what they did on the field. And if what they did off the field, their crimes against the game, their crimes against humanity are so terrible, then I believe those crimes should be placed on their plaques and enshrined on those plaques forever, right next to their accomplishments. We don't know what we don't know about these athletes that we're voting on. And we especially don't know much about them today. I mean, you mentioned...
Yeah, and that's where I want to go. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know very much. And the reason why we know more is because of journalists like you who dedicate part of their life to writing these kinds of books and covering these characters. And as I said, you wrote this interesting piece in The Atlantic about why we'll miss sports journalism when it's gone, and it was response to the big cuts at Sports Illustrated. Sports journalism, certainly classic baseball sports journalism, it's not in the process of going, it's gone, hasn't it? this is a brave new world, Keith.
There are fewer and fewer reporters in our professional sports locker rooms every single day. And the access that reporters once had 30, 40 years ago is long gone. And so, what we know about these players today, and I mean truly know about them, is less and less, and more controlled by the players, by the leagues, by the teams. We simply don't know what
They're
we
just
don't know.
boring. I mean, they have their PR people do their Instagrams or their Facebook pages, so they become increasingly generic, don't they?
Well, I don't know if generic is the word, but they become increasingly packaged without question.
Right. Well, generic is packaged or generic. That's why. Who's the footballer Rodgers, the one who there was some rumors that he would run with Trump?
Aaron Rodgers.
I mean, my wife loathes him for good reason, but I wonder whether a guy like Rodgers is himself like Charlie Hustle, part of a different age.
It's a great insight there, Andrew. I will say, when you go back and you read the sports coverage from the 1960s, 70s, and even the 1980s, and you read the kind of quotes and comments that players, not just Pete Rose, but that other players and managers made to the press after games or in feature stories, I mean, none of them would survive it today. They would be pilloried instantaneously on every social media platform. Guys, athletes, men and women, spoke openly in those days, and many of the things that lots of people said were controversial or would be considered controversial today.
And yet, or perhaps because of all this, those were the glory days of baseball. Should we look back, Keith, with a degree of nostalgia? I get the sense that for you have an element of nostalgia, but you're also a hard-headed journalist. You've reported on this rather tragic story of Pete Rose. And in some ways, I guess you're celebrating the end of those years, and in another way, you're missing them. Is that fair?
Well, I think that is fair in general. And I will say, the suggestion that these were the last glory days of baseball doesn't mean that there aren't things to enjoy or celebrate about baseball now. But there's no question that the amount of interest and excitement that baseball created in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s is far greater than it does today. And I think you can draw a straight line from the banishment of Pete Rose in 1989 to many of the problems that exist in baseball today. That summer when Pete was being investigated for his gambling, rightly so, several players, including prominent players in Oakland, California with the Oakland A's, were already injecting themselves with steroids, which would ultimately reshape the game in ways that no one could have imagined at that time. But those changes, really did affect the game and lead to some of the rule changes that baseball just instituted last year, just to make the game more interesting and give it a quicker pace again. So, Pete Rose lived in this time. He rose and he fell in this time. And I do think 35 years on, we are still sorting through the wreckage that he left behind.
Finally, you've done a wonderful job, Keith, both in the book and on the show, talking about Rose. What does this story tell us about the America of the 2020s, leaving aside baseball? Is it a cautionary tale? Is it a celebration? When so many people, particularly certain kinds of politicians, are mourning the end of America, the death of America, the demise of America, what does this story of Charlie Hustle tell us about the America of the 2020s?
Well, I do think it's a universal tale, the story of Pete Rose. I do think it's far more than a baseball story. I do think that there are themes with some of the cultural and political forces that we are dealing with now, that were prominent in the making of Pete Rose in the 1970s in particular. This desire to constantly think the times are changing for the worse. And I do think at the end of the day, what makes Pete Rose's story most interesting is not that it's black and white, but that there's gray. And I think we have a tendency, especially now, to want to put people into one or two buckets, the good bucket or the bad bucket. I think the most interesting stories aren't just black and white, but gray. And what I've hopefully done here is painted a portrait of a time and of a person that is at times black, is at times white, and is ultimately very gray.
Well, it's a gray story, but it's a shiningly gray story. It's not boring, is it?
I hope not, Andrew.
And funnily enough, in 2024, in the election, you're going to have a Trump-Biden rematch. Both men from the age of Pete Rose, both perhaps representing very different sides of Rose, even both from the same neighborhoods, similar metaphors about them. It's rather eerie, isn't it?
Well, we could do a whole nother show on the 2024 presidential
Maybe
election.
you need your follow-up book. Who do you think Rose would vote for?
I don't know, but I do have some speculation.
Well, speculate. Tell me.
Well, I know that I will say this. I know that Donald Trump has spoken warmly of Pete Rose in the past.
Surprise.
I do know that Pete has spent some time watching Fox News, but I don't know how he would vote. I do not.